Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's just a few minutes before the time when Ambassador Frank Wisner is scheduled to address us by Zoom. So let me welcome you on behalf of the council to our fall conference here at the Cosmos Club. A bit of a replay in a way, maybe an augmented replay of our spring conference devoted to attending to the proverbial elephant in the room of international relations today, the conflict in Ukraine, but widening our aperture a bit to focus also on the pending, looming potential crisis with China and Taiwan. We have witnessed in the last 8 months horrors in Europe, in the destruction and abuses in Ukraine that haven't been seen in Europe since the 1990s, actually, right? Since the wars in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Kosovo. But in this case, it's not a civil war, it's an invasion of Ukraine by Russia, by its neighbor, a neighbor that recognized Ukraine repeatedly, both. No one seems to mention that Ukraine was a voting member of the United Nations, along with Belarus, for the UN's entire existence up to Ukraine's actual independence after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. So it's not like Ukraine is a newcomer or a totally fictitious entrant into the international community until Vladimir Putin decided to abrogate and ignore Russia's previous agreements about and guaranteeing security to Ukraine. We'll have a chance to go into that extensively with Ambassador Wisner today, whom Tim Chorba, our president, will introduce, and with our first panel. So welcome. I hope you find the conference enlightening and beneficial, and we'll have, I think, a good morning and lunch. Thanks.
So it's a great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Frank Wisner to open once again a semi-annual Council of American Ambassadors Conference. A Princeton graduate who entered the Foreign Service shortly after college graduation, Ambassador Wisner initially served as a young officer in Tangier, Morocco, and then in Algiers. Incidentally, I believe that the American Consulate General in Tangier may be the oldest extant U.S. diplomatic building, and it's now the focus of a public-private partnership to assure its preservation. From North Africa, as a now more senior Foreign Service officer, it was on to Vietnam, Tunisia, and Bangladesh, followed by a stint as Deputy Director of the President's Indochina Task Force, responsible for evacuating and resettling nearly 1 million refugees, and then followed by service as Deputy Executive Secretary of the State Department under Secretary of State Cyrus Vance. By the late 1970s, Ambassador Wisner began the first of 4 ambassadorships that spanned an almost 2-decade period. That first post was in Zambia, eventually followed by Egypt, the Philippines, and India, all countries of obviously great consequence to the United States. Between his ambassadorships in the Philippines and in India, Ambassador Wisner served sequentially as Undersecretary of State for International Security Affairs and then as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Years after his 1997 retirement from the State Department, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice appointed Ambassador Wisner as Special Representative to Kosovo status talks in 2005, at which he played a pivotal role in negotiating Kosovo's independence. While all of that professional biography is extraordinarily impressive, a footnote to history is that for part of Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1993, Ambassador Wisner served as the acting Secretary of State pending Senate confirmation of Warren Christopher as Secretary. With that, we now turn the podium over to Ambassador Wisner to share with us his observations about the conflict raging in Ukraine and preoccupying the world. Ambassador Wisner.
Tim, Chorba, your introductions, as usual, are excessively generous, and I appreciate them. Appreciate what you have done today, but I also want to say thank you to all of the members of the council for your continued hospitality and willingness to entertain remarks from me on a near annual basis. I want to add a quick word of thanks as well to Grace McAllister, whose technical skills are unequaled and has made it possible for me to join you today by Zoom. So Grace, thank you. Tim, again, a word of thanks to you. As you correctly introduced me, my intention is to think with you all for a moment this morning about Ukraine. But I think I do so in full agreement with everyone gathered today that Ukraine is one of an unprecedented number of major international troubles. It's not only part of the return of great power rivalry, it is taking place at the time of major international concern over climate change. Sharm el-Sheikh is underway with COP22. We have to consider as well the global financial crisis, which threatens countries around the world, and recession even stalks our doors together with inflation. The fourth issue that must continue to be on our minds is the prevalence of pandemics. While COVID is receded a bit, we have not finished it, and other pandemics loom in the future. And finally, the awful return of nuclear proliferation, not just Russia and Ukraine, over Ukraine, but Iran continues to expand its nuclear holdings. And then, of course, we're facing the truculent behavior of North Korea as it moves not only to increase its nuclear holdings, but its delivery systems. So unfortunately, I can't turn to you today and say 2023 offers a prospect of relief. It doesn't. None of the crises that I mentioned are going to play out quickly. And more serious for all of us is, while we recognize that American influence in dealing with these crises will be important, it will be on the margins. And if we're not very careful, our continuing partisan divide will complicate our ability to deal with these crises, will complicate American influence in each one of them. I spoke the other evening with Richard Haass, the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, just back from Korea. He brought the disturbing news that fully 60% of Koreans now, South Koreans now believe it's important to have a nuclear weapon. And they do so because they do not trust our steadfastness. They trace it back to the previous administration, but it is a fact that we have to contend with. Our image abroad is troubled, as all of you have known. But behind all of this, I think, are persistent bad habits in the Republic about foreign policy, habits of assumption that America can fix things if it just puts its mind to it. I believe that Ronald Reagan had it absolutely right in 1980, when he said that the basis of a free and principled foreign policy is one that takes the world as it is, seeks to change it by leadership and example, and not by harangue, harassment, or wishful thinking. And he might have added, by the excessive use of military force. So we are faced with a period of transition in American foreign policy, adapting ourselves to more limited means, meaning a more carefully defined set of pursuits and outcomes, even as we face this unprecedented, turbulent international situation. But today's purpose, and mine with you, is to think more carefully about the deadly conflict that we're locked into with Russia, for which there is no end in sight, and the dangers of escalation are real. And the consequences of this crisis continue and will be magnified. So, to make the obvious points, February 24 stands out in history as the day that Putin's outrage began. But we have to, I think, understand clearly that Putin's assumptions at the outset were deeply flawed, but not without precedent. He believed he could decapitate Ukraine's leadership and return the country to Russian hegemony. His intelligence was badly flawed. He also assumed that his military means would be consequential and he could make short shrift of a military campaign. He counted on European weakness as Europe entered a number of elections, and American weakness with America distracted. He looked back on the lessons of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Georgia, then the very limited reactions over the takeover of Crimea, and then he watched the American retreat from Afghanistan to figure the time might be right to make a bold move and get away with it. I think he also assumed that there would be no kickback inside Russia, that he fully controlled Russian politics, and that there would be no substantial opposition to a Russian play of force. I think he assumed as well that whatever the West did, imposing sanctions, could be outlived. He will be proved wrong in this regard, not in the short run, but in the long term, as capital and technology dries up, and Russia has found herself isolated economically in terms of the major developments that lie ahead in the global economy. So I think all of us recognize this war has taken a series of sharp turns. I put it in four basic phases. The first was the invasion itself, which was largely checked by the Ukrainians on the outskirts of Kiev, and then the summer reversals after Putin tried to reinforce the Donbass, Ukraine's ability to recover by August, coming into September, substantial elements of lost territory. The fights now in stage 3 for the south to see if the Ukrainians have the strength to cross the Dnieper River and put the Kherson region at risk for Russia and complicating Russia's hold even over Crimea, not to mention the previous clear dream of controlling all of Ukraine's Black Sea coast and Odessa. So where are we headed in that stage 4? And here I have to speculate a bit with you, and that is that we are headed towards a looming stalemate. As Russia continues to build up its reserves and equipment, and the Ukrainian infrastructure is brought under maintained siege that strikes its electrical power generation, immiserates its population. All of these factors play out increasingly to a war of nerves, not only with Ukrainians, but a war of nerves with the United States and Europe. So my starting point today is stalemate and the consequences of it, and how are we going to deal with that? For there really is no political nor military end in sight at the moment. I believe Russia's defeat on the battlefield is extremely unlikely and risky at best, at great cost, even an attempt to make it happen. The consequences of Putin's own problems at home, and they're real, cannot be the basis of serious American policy. But let's not forget that cafes in Moscow are abuzz with chat conversations about the debacle that Putin has led Russia into. And this criticism is basically unprecedented, indicating a loss of confidence. It's taken public form in open attacks or direct criticism, even from close Putin allies. Evgeny Prigozhin of the Wagner Group and Ramzan Kadyrov, the very truculent Chechen leader. These are all pretty unprecedented, but they do not mean that Putin has lost control of Russia. I do not believe that's the case. And I do not believe that even if it were the case, that we're looking for a Navalny-type democratic succession in Russia. What we would be looking at is a period of great unpredictability. And with that unpredictability, the danger is we've seen Putin display of truculence, risk-taking. The attributes of Russian weakness is to strike back and to complicate an already desperately dangerous situation. So I am not prepared to say that I know where Russia is headed, but I think it's fool's gold to think it's headed in a manner that provides early relief to us, to our policymakers, and to our responsibilities towards Ukraine. Finally, when I go down my list, I have to conclude that the Ukrainian defeat is also unlikely. Never, I think, have any of us watched a nation braver stand up to external pressure the way Ukraine has. The national resolve has been quite unprecedented. But that doesn't mean that human will overcome the facts on the ground. And I come back to the prospect of stalemate. There are those who worry in the short run we could see an escalation on the nuclear front. I'm not as persuaded as some commentators are that this is an early risk. I think Putin understands, as his generals do, how difficult it is to fight on a poisoned battlefield. That's why Colin Powell tried to return tactical nuclear weapons to the Air Force. He didn't want American soldiers to chance their luck on such battlefields. But I think the issue goes beyond purely tactics and military gains or losses, but to political realities. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that China is deadly opposed to any use of nuclear weapons by Russia, and the Russia-China axis is of critical importance to Putin. China believes use of nukes will literally let the genie out of the bottle, and you'll see dangerous escalation of nuclear capabilities around the world, which will endanger China as they will endanger us. So I think that whether you're talking about China or India or other people who are looking at Putin and not wishing to cross him, that the nuclear issue is an impediment. And it's good for Putin to show his resolve at home, but it's not a warfighting weapon. Now, if we are facing stalemate, which is the core of my argument, the stress is going to be in part on Western solidarity. Are we and our European friends going to be able to stand up to a period of protracted tension? What will be the effect of energy markets while temporarily improved slightly? European economic performance is deeply compromised, and our own prospects are still uncertain as to whether we're going to have a recession, a deep or a shallow one, with energy being a major cost factor driving our own economy. These are all factors that undermine political resolve, election results notwithstanding. You have to as well calculate the international consequences of a protracted stalemate between Russia and Ukraine to the international economy, prospects of recession. But look at the financial peril in which many, many nations around the world are currently facing with inadequate resources in the IMF or even from donor countries to face the needs of Africa, Latin Americans who depend on debt markets for relief. So the LDCs not only face financial pressure, but terribly complex food supply and energy supply problems that can undermine core stability. My eyes are on the Middle East, Lebanon included, where core stability is very much at risk. But I don't take off the table as I look at the prospects of stalemate, the loss of bandwidth for the United States. Ukraine, as we have all agreed at the outset, is not alone among world problems, but it's sucking the air out of the room. And even if we avoid a tussle in Congress over support with Ukraine, which is my prediction, we really don't have the time and attention to deal with issues, deal properly, concentrated with issues like North Korea, the Western Balkans, not to mention the broader global agenda, economic, climate change. I remain reasonably optimistic about the stability of the Ukrainian political equation. Much to all surprise, Zelensky continues to herd his cats with some skill, but over time, who knows, that won't be the same. So let's begin to look ahead. What does stalemate mean? How do we begin to think our way through it and past it? For stalemate is a consequence of a war, and almost all wars, with rare exceptions, the end of World War II being a clear example with Germany and Japan, all wars end with a political outcome. That's the political word of Clausewitz in his great book on war, war being an extension of politics by other means. All wars end with some form of political outcome, political settlement. And so what about Ukraine? How do we get there? We certainly watched our colleagues in the Congress on the Democratic Progressive side stumble over this issue and make a pure mess of it by arguing in favor of premature negotiations, and they had their ears pinned back, and rightfully so. But the core idea that they were driving at, that we have to keep our eye focused on a negotiated outcome, was dead right. And we've lost something in the kerfuffle that followed their failed letter. A political settlement is going to be hard to achieve, and it only can be done if we, the Ukrainians and our European allies, stick together and we pick our priorities and our timing in a common manner. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to give it a push. The word that Jake Sullivan is in touch with his Russian counterpart was welcome news to my ears. And speaking to the Council on Foreign Relations night before last, when pressed by a questioner as to the results of his talks with the Russians, Jake Sullivan was wisely silent, refused to answer the question, which is exactly where we should be at this delicate stage in trying to figure out a way forward. There are some who've argued that maybe China or India or Turkey could step in and kind of do some mediation. I'm highly resistant to that idea. I don't mind a bit of their anxiety, but I see no purpose in their being part of the outcome. You lose control of the outcome if you bring in major players like them. It would compromise Ukraine's abilities and our own to see our way forward. The better example of the use of international suasion is the communications between the administration and the Crown Prince President of the UAE, Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, when he went to Russia with 3 messages from us, cleared with us. Do not use do not continue your attacks on the nuclear power center. It's an extraordinarily dangerous moment. Message 1. Message 2, lay off the threats of nukes, for they are really destabilizing the global scene. And 3, prepare yourself for a political outcome. So we're obviously at the very beginning stage. And if my experience tells me anything, and all of you are such skilled diplomats, the council playing its own role, I think before I think of negotiations, I think of small steps that would create more fertile ground for an engagement. Prisoner releases, maybe getting the unfortunate Mrs. Greiner out and some Russian counterparts from this country. Some relaxation, sustained relaxation, not just on prisoners, but on food exports, to begin to prepare a sense of momentum, prepare the ground, show that actually agreements can be reached, even if they don't go to the core of the problem that Russian aggression in Ukraine underscores. But there's little prospect even of small steps gathering momentum at this stage. Timing is going to be everything. And I believe we're not going to see much of an opportunity to begin to hope for sustained diplomacy until the current round of fighting, the cold weather, the mud takes over, and we're into the spring of next year. That's my timetable, but it's utterly fanciful and purely idiosyncratic. What's the first step in a negotiation? It should be a ceasefire to at least get the parties to stop fighting. And that then creates a framework, a basis, a platform on which other steps can be taken. So what are some of the elements we ought to be looking at? We can't talk about a negotiation with any detail. We can think about elements of what a politically based outcome would look like. There really ought to be a sustained ability to stand down the forces. There should be a set of guarantees that nuclear weapons will not be part of the Eastern European equation, Ukrainian equation. I do not believe at the end of the day, I know at the end of the day, Ukraine will not join NATO, but Ukraine's going to need some form of security guarantees, and perhaps a regional non-aggression treaty might be a way forward. So Ukraine's going to need more than that. It's going to need an assured supply of weaponry, particularly if there is an outbreak of violence again in the future. It's going to need substantial economic aid well beyond the $3 to $5 billion a month the war is costing it and all of us. But it's going to need some way to manage this dreadful issue of the Donbass territories. I don't put Crimea on my list because I really don't see how that enters the equation any more than I believe we ought to give up Ukraine's claim to Crimea. I just don't quite see how that claim can be activated, operationalized, if you will, at this stage. But what about the Donbass territories? What about Luhansk, Donetsk, that the Russians have now absorbed and the Ukrainians correctly claim is part of their national territory? Is there some UN-sponsored holding pattern that would produce a lot of local autonomy under some international aegis for 20 years and then a plebiscite as an outcome? Is there an overall understanding that could be reached along those lines that would sterilize the territorial claim question. But then I have to take a step back and appeal to all of you. The end is not solely about Ukraine. The end is the elusive goal of trying to achieve some understanding and stability between what I am certain will be a weakened Russia and Europe. A weakened Russia is not a Russia that will be easier to deal with. In fact, it's a different problem. It's a different problem set. We all recognize that Russia and Russian security is part of the West and Western security. At the same time, we also understand that Russia is not part of the West. And therefore, in that dilemma, how do you find a balance between Russian inclusion and Russian exclusion that could give us some prospect of stability? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I fear I don't have an answer. There were a number of attempts in December of last year to find a way forward on that dicey set of questions. But let me remind all of us, continuing to work to find ways to address it, going well beyond the old NATO-Russia understandings, the Partnership for Peace is to a new equilibrium of some sort, which will always, I predict, be fragile. But with that vexing question on the table, let me stop my remarks. I hope my voice came through, and if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Tim, back to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wisner, for your commentary and your insights, and we'll open the floor for questioning with Ambassador Stuart Bernstein.
Always enjoy listening to you and your comments. Brilliant. You said something about the economic sanctions. We haven't seen that yet. What makes you feel like they are working?
I never believed that they would work, Stuart, in the short run. And they rarely ever do. If they are not perceived as, for example, the South Africans did, as a deep signal of what could come later, they will not work. Nations tend to stand up to external pressure in the short run and adapt ways of coping. But in this case, I think the real effect of sanctions is not in the short run. It will not cripple Russia's war effort. In fact, there's a bit of the rally around the flag boys and a lot of profit taking as Russian enterprise sneaks into the cracks left by outsiders as they withdrew from the market. But the real crisis for Russia is in the medium to long run. For Russia will be cut off from business, will be cut off from trade, will be cut off from finance, will be cut off from technology flows for years to come. That's the real price that Russia is paying. And you can be absolutely certain by the time the issue of sanctions becomes part of a political negotiation, it's going to be hellishly difficult for us to pull those sanctions back. We're not very good at it. I think if I counted the introduction of sanctions on Cuba in the late 1950s, they're still there or worse. Sanctions have a terrible habit of acquiring their own life. So Russia is going to live with the consequences of a sanctions regime for years to come. And this will only deepen Russia's economic dilemma of being able to modernize its economy, care for its people, and play the global role that Russia's leaders claim Russia was born to play. Seriously weakened economy, advancing in its weakness, not retreating, and sanctions over time will be a major factor.
Ambassador William Iko.
Thank you again for your terrific remarks. I'm curious as to your perspective on whether or not we'll see any shift in American policy and America's military support of Ukraine, weaponry, et cetera, after last night's election results are clear. We know that in the recent election, the Russians were very active on social media, trying to promote certain, politicians who they felt would be more sympathetic to their perspective. We saw J.D. Vance win, for example, in Ohio, who has called for an end to the U.S. support of Ukraine, military support. Doesn't think we should be spending our money on that. And if the U.S. is not there, then Ukraine is left really without its strongest supporter or ally in this military engagement. So what might happen? And will we see a shift? Because I think the Republican Party appears to be split on whether or not we should be continuing that support. And, as you mentioned, the Democratic Party is a little bit split. So what might happen going forward? And does this simply feed, if we don't support them strongly enough, doesn't that simply feed Russia to maintain its perspective and say, look, we're getting this out because that military support will end?
You've articulated a really significant risk extremely well. So I'm not going to take issue with it, but let me introduce a couple of thoughts that might help you get your hands around it, and then we'll see how time plays out. First of all, I think the reason the Democratic progressives had their ears pinned back was because the majority of the leadership, the White House, and Democrat rank and file are basically lined up solidly on the Ukraine matter, and nuance of negotiations is not something that sells easily to the American public, Democratic or Republican. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be negotiations, and there will be, but I think the Democrats are not my concern. On the Republican side, you're right to underscore the divisions, but they are manifestations of a deeper problem, and that is the longer wars go on, the more antsy public opinion becomes about the cost of those wars, whether it's blood or blood and treasure or just treasure. There is an underlying problem, and that's why I think we have to keep our mind focused on a negotiated end. But is, in fact, there any lively early prospect of a reversal of American policy and a withdrawal of American support? I think not. The election results of last night remain to be clarified. We don't yet know what the size of the Republican majority in the House is going to be, but the narrower it is, the harder it's going to be to move the House, nor do we know the full outcome of the Senate yet. But we know that we're headed into breathtakingly small margins and with deeply felt opposition, and the Republican side has deeply felt commitments on the Russia-Ukraine matter. Senator McConnell, great figures in the Republican Party, Kate Bailey Hutchison and others couldn't be more stalwart on the question of Ukraine. So will the new leadership in the House want to take on Ukraine and withdrawing support from Ukraine when everything else is going to be at stake, putting together strategies for debt, strategies for the economy, strategies for law and order, all the other strategies that need to be articulated with majorities mobilized behind them? I think the greatest risk is not a withdrawal, quote unquote, of support for the war effort in Ukraine, but the soft end, or the end of the spear that bothers me the most is the budget. There could be real pressure brought to bear on the budget, and the budget end up being a covert way of expressing opposition to Ukraine. So much more to be played out. I don't think it's the first issue that's going to be on the table. But in the end, everyone's going to be watching for reassurance around the world. Our word is not fully held. So months ahead are going to be just critical. My own view is Ukraine and the American Congress is not a tomorrow subject.
Let me interject a question before we turn to Ambassador Towell. Coming back, Frank, to something that you and I discussed last week, which is Putin's future. Immediately after that, there appeared the feature for the review section of the Wall Street Journal on the weekend. The front page is devoted to the feature article "After Putin," quotes, with the subheading, "Russia's president could lose power in any number of ways. What will the end of his rule mean for his own country, Ukraine, and the world?" 8 authors, including Angela Stent and Michael McFall, contributed thoughtful and provocative commentaries to this compilation of opinions. For his part, Professor Michael Kimmage of Catholic University, who has held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio on the State Department's policy planning staff, authored a piece, "Shakespearean Tragedy in the Making." His article begins colorfully as follows: "Russian politics is a Shakespearean play, but which one is it? Will some Brutus plunge in the dagger, provoking unrest without end? Is Vladimir Putin Lear-like and out of touch, destined for madness? Or does he more resemble Richard III, distorted in vision and evil at heart, living and then dying by the sword? Russian politics evokes Shakespeare because so much depends on one man, and because, like Shakespeare's history plays, it is moving inexorably toward tragedy." Frank, in your view, are necessarily speculative exercises of this nature productive, and do they create any groundwork for policy planning?
Well, Tim, your question, I really loved your predicate, particularly the Shakespearean reminder of the relevance of Shakespeare. But to your question, I, over the years, have come very firmly to the view that if you try to base American policy on assumptions about another country's domestic order, you run huge risks. You run risks because your understanding of the nature of that other man's politics and the consequences of abrupt changes in those politics is by definition distant and imperfect. You cannot estimate with any accuracy, no matter how smart you are, and some of the writers who contribute to that piece are very smart and very well informed. You cannot understand the dynamics that would occur, particularly given the fact that the history of Russian politics is highly clandestine. Look at the change from Khrushchev to Brezhnev, look at the Stalin succession, look at various czarist intrigues over the years. The transfer of power in Russia can be extremely clandestine, and the dynamics behind it hard to see. So my advice to American policymakers is don't try to guess what the other side's going to do. Keep an eye out for it, of course. But instead, think what your interests are. Think about how you evolve sensible policies, how you build alliances around those policies, and then let the Russian nature take its course, because we really cannot be certain what the outcome would be in Moscow. And while it's lovely to think that if Putin wasn't there as the engineer of this debacle, things would somehow get better, I am going to put that in the category of magical thinking. and extremely dangerous. So, as I would say the same for Iran or Russia or anyone, any nation in whom we have an adversarial relationship, look to your own politics, your own policies first, and let the other man's policies play out. You can't really influence them, and they may not play out the way you want them to. Let me just address, I think, a critically important one, Europe. I have to say, despite much hand-wringing in this country, that the degree of European solidarity has literally surprised me and pleased me, and I think has, over the question of Ukraine, some enduring capabilities. Let's think back just only weeks ago, dire predictions of energy markets, cold winters, really unhappy Europeans, all still possible, but Europe has collectively and individually adopted a number of domestic strategies to alleviate energy shortages. Let's look at the course of energy markets themselves. As the molecules have filled the reserves, the price of gas has even begun to tip a bit. I don't want to count on that being an enduring fact, but the issue is nonetheless greater supply than was initially thought. But I think something more important is at stake, and that is Europeans may have thought there was strategic autonomy in balancing a bit the dependence on the United States, unreliable as they sometimes fear we might be, and broadening and having some inclusive approach towards Russia that would smooth out the long-term future of Europe. That's all been Mrs. Merkel's heritage, I'm afraid, for her memory, has been in the garbage can. And Europeans are now recognized that the energy weapon in the hands of Moscow is a dagger right at the edge of Europe's heart. And Europe isn't going to back away from that. Look at the outcome of the Italian election. We were told that Mrs. Meloni was going to swing to the east. She clearly is not doing that. There are a lot of reasons. But look at Scholz's own management of this issue. I actually think there's more stuff in the European Turkey than we gave it credit for, and that Europe is not forever. And that's why stalemate doesn't work to anybody's advantage. But for the near and medium term, we've got a much stronger ally in Europe than we had any reason to think in spring of this year and summer.
So, Ambassador Tal, thank you for your question, which led to a very productive response. To the back of the room, Ambassador Michael DeSombre.
Ambassador, thank you very much. In contemplating potential endgames for Russia and Ukraine that would be acceptable to both of them, which obviously is the only way you have an acceptable endgame, how much should we think about how that will be viewed by other strategic adversaries around the world, particularly China? And when you contemplate an endgame that not only would cement Crimea in Russia's hands, but also potentially have some control over the Donbass or others, resulting in what could be characterized as a win in some respect in terms of territory, are we concerned that that might encourage other countries like China to perhaps be a little bit more adventuresome in their activities?
Well, there's an assumption built into your question, which I will come to in a moment, but let me start out and say there is no outcome. You're absolutely right in your opening remark. There is no outcome that isn't acceptable to both sides. That doesn't mean that a certain degree of pressure and suasion to get to an outcome isn't advisable, but you cannot superimpose the outside on Kiev or on Moscow. They've got to find their own level. And you can fuel the argument, fuel the debate that gets you there with good ideas and bridging ideas and formulations and structures. But in the end, the parties have got to agree to it. And if they don't, then God help you. You have the peace agreement that you finally see emerge lasts for about as long as the dew remains on your lawn, and you're back in trouble again. So let's always keep our eye on what's going to be mutually acceptable. Plus, I think there are sincere issues which you point to, real issues you point to of right and wrong and who has suffered. What I am trying to hint at this stage, you can't talk about what a negotiation looks like and not look like, but what are some elements that we ought to be thinking about that could be woven in the future into an outcome? That's how I came out, because I do not see the outcome being negotiated anytime soon, and if it is, only with careful change of the ground and the opening of back channels that are still prehensile in their form. So I'm not predicting, and I certainly am not predicting an outcome in which Ukraine would surrender territory. That far be it from my eye. But that would not be the first time in history that a nation lost effective control, but did not lose de jure, de facto, but not de jure control. If my memory is correct, and Tim, you can perhaps, Tim Chorba, you could perhaps remind me better, but we never accepted the fact that Russia had swallowed Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And I remember as a child walking past the Latvian legation in Washington, some aged gentleman sitting out front. We never accepted the absorption of these territories into the Soviet Union as a de jure matter. As a de facto matter, it was different. And so is it not possible for Crimea? Crimea, I don't see any reason why we should concede Crimea to Russia as a de jure question, though I don't see any great advantage to the Ukrainians in trying to fight for it without paying unacceptable price for what could potentially be a negative outcome. So I think you can look at the future, whether it's the Donbass or Crimea, and try to find some neutral place that would give you protection of the rights of Ukraine without making it impossible for Russia to wink and nod and take a step back.
All right, I see 4 more questions, and we'll try to take them all. We'll start in the back of the room next to Ambassador de Sambre.
Hi, Ambassador Wisner. Thank you for your remarks. Just wanted to follow up on that last point you were making about a potential settlement requiring some kind of modus vivendi in Donbass and Luhansk and you know, possibly, if that is the contour of a settlement that's to live with at least, you know, pending a referendum 20 years. Why isn't that something that Washington should really be focusing on right away and making that to develop something along those lines, as opposed to an extended settlement that, or stalemate, excuse me, which you predicted, but raises a lot of questions about cohesion and all that? Why shouldn't we? Maybe I don't want to read things into your comments, but I didn't know if you were saying that basically, yeah, we should just let a stalemate simmer, or whether our policy should be to promote a settlement along the lines you're suggesting.
Let me be clear then.
Aggressively and as quickly as possible. Thank you.
I apologize for leaving you in a state of doubt. I predict a stalemate. And I believe a stalemate is unacceptable for every reason that you've just outlined. That the dangers of resolve melting away, of the costs Ukraine would pay on the way there, the deterioration of our domestic. So I apologize. I was saying to the last question, I apologize for not being clearer. What I was trying to say in my remarks is that I believe a stalemate is likely, but a stalemate is unacceptable. It cannot last. Therefore, we have to begin to think about what follows a stalemate and get our minds around the fact there's got to be a political settlement. But then the question is, and it is always the question in negotiations, is when. A great set of ideas advanced at the wrong time becomes a bad set of ideas. And I think our friends on the Democratic left have just proved that point by raising in an awkward manner an inevitability at the wrong time, the wrong way, and in the wrong context. They really set back a perfectly useful discussion about endgames. But I also believe that we cannot at this stage predict when a negotiation will come together. We should be working on channels of communications, of solidifying our approach with our European and Ukrainian allies, of going over options, of thinking through strategies. But in the best world of diplomacy, keeping all of this low key, because the time is not now right. The battlefield is white hot, and it isn't at all clear to me that there's going to be an abatement on the military front anytime soon. So think, seek channels, focus on things that can be done that could create a movement on the ground towards a negotiation. Think about elements of a negotiation, but don't at this stage consider a negotiation likely. Does that answer your question?
Yes, although maybe you could expand just briefly on why you think the Democratic left or progressive proposal was so ill-timed.
Well, first of all, it's absolutely clear they didn't get themselves sorted out, so they turned on each other. They also were out of step with their own Democratic leadership, which must have been taken by surprise. So tactically, the matter was flawed. And to surface a bunch of rather brave and important ideas at the white heat of the election season would not have been my choice of timing. Was the idea of opening a debate about negotiations useful? Yes, but it should have been in December, not in October.
Thank you. Ambassador Lena Marks.
Thank you so much for an extraordinary address today. You mentioned prior about UAE and you alluded to South Africa. I just served as ambassador to South Africa. And I wondered your thoughts about the role or non-role of BRICS, just briefly, in this whole problem. Thank you.
The BRICS confabulation is of great importance to Russia, and a sense that Russia has got allies. But as an operational entity, particularly a political operational entity, BRICS has absolutely no standing. And on top of which, no capacity. On top of which, I know that in Moscow yesterday, when Jai Shankar, the Indian foreign minister, sat down with Lavrov and others in the Russian leadership, he was acting as a good member of the BRICS. He was acting with full knowledge that India's most important external relationship is with the United States. And under the table, he was saying, for God's sakes, Prime Minister Modi wants you to bring this war to an end. It's endangering all of us. So I am certain one way or the other, the BRICS members don't want to see Russia humiliated, but they really want to see this war end. Having said that, and while I don't believe BRICS will, as an institution, will change Putin's way of thinking, the moral suasion behind it being somewhat important, I think it's worth our remembering that we have to be more careful. I am a major, stout critic of the profligate use of American sanctions, particularly financial sanctions. We are pushing the world towards other economic mobilizations that will weaken the capacity of the United States to have this huge advantage on the international economic scene. I believe we're forcing others to think about alternatives to SWIFT, alternatives to Wall Street, alternatives that create a way around American economic sanctions by our overuse of those sanctions and our failure to ground them in deep international consensus. So while I don't think BRICS is the engine for it per se, I believe there's a big message for Americans in the emergence of entities like BRICS, that our influence on the economic stage in the world is not forever given, and the overuse of it will destroy it.
So we have time for one final question. We'll give the floor to Governor Gilmore, whose card is the last one standing.
Okay, well, thank you very much. First of all, Frank, I think this was really helpful today. This put things in good perspective, and I certainly appreciate it. We're going to go into a panel following this to discuss the Ukrainian matter, and you've set the stage very well. I want to focus on the issue of negotiations and ceasefires for just a moment, because I think that's been much of your conversation here. My view is all of this is politics. All of it, whether it's military negotiations, sanctions, it's all politics. And the question is, what particular vehicle are you using to achieve a particular policy and political goal? So my question to you is, react, if you would, to the idea that a ceasefire actually produces a political outcome that's very helpful to the Russians, to Putin. He would like to have a ceasefire. He would like to have a negotiation because it assists his political goal. And his political goal, I think, is the expansion of the Russian Empire. I don't think it has anything to do with Russian security. So here, I'll sit down for just a minute, but let me just spin out an example and get you to react to it. You know, what if Stalingrad had occurred, the Americans had succeeded on D-Day, and Hitler had just said, well, okay, I get it. Let's enter into negotiations to ceasefire now, and I'll take over Eastern Europe and a quarter of France, and we'll have a ceasefire. And that would have been a really great political outcome for Hitler. Isn't there danger here that, you know, Americans and diplomats just love negotiations. We just live for this stuff. And the political outcome could actually be very harmful if we get into ceasefires and negotiations. And I'll sit down by also saying that I think you actually made that point by talking about timing on all of this.
Yeah, thanks, Governor. Pleasure to be with you again. I think we've got to be careful. Yes, you use the word politics. We use statecraft or policy. It's not about negotiations. It's about managing conflicts. This conflict will have an end. And as I said, and I deeply believe, you're not going to defeat Russia. She isn't going to give up and disappear as a problem in Ukraine or as a long-term issue in the balance of power between East and West. So you've got to figure a bigger chessboard you're playing on than simply the tactical advances or retreats in the Donbass. Even there, I'm arguing, as I've tried to today, that a military outcome in the Donbass is, in my judgment, unlikely. We'll see as we go through mud and freezing rains and snows and see where the battlefield ends up. But I do not believe that there is a military outcome that drives Russia back and that brings an end to the crisis. So you got to figure out a political way forward. And that's where the word negotiations is a technique, not an objective. It's how you get parties together to stop doing what is harmful to your interests. And this endless war in Ukraine is clearly harmful to our interests. So we need constantly to focus on that, but we got to get the time right. We have to have the elements right. We have to have the channels open. None of that's going to come soon or easily, but we have to get our minds around it. So my appeal is not negotiations for negotiations, Governor. My appeal is to keep our minds on where our interests lie and how we get there.
So, Ambassador Wisner, thank you very much for that tour de force assessment of what may lie ahead with the Ukraine conflict. In closing, turning briefly to another potential flashpoint, as I noted in my introduction at the beginning of the hour, over 25 years ago, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice appointed you as the U.S. Special Representative to the Kosovo status talks. In collaboration with the Council of Albanian Ambassadors, our council is in advanced discussion concerning a delegation traveling to the Balkans early next May for a fact-finding visit to Albania, Kosovo, and North Macedonia. When our delegation is firmed up and our itinerary definitive, we would like to turn to you for a Zoom meeting to gain the benefit of your experience and insights concerning the region and the role that you played in bringing about Kosovo's independence from Serbia. We hope that you'll be available for us then. Finally, at the conclusion of each iteration of our annual conference seance with you, we are delighted to present you with a modest token of our appreciation. In the past, those have included cufflinks, a council tie, and our Christmas tree ornament. By now, we've exhausted our selection of council gifts for you, but I'll happily be sending to you a recently published book by our CAA member, David McKean, Ambassador David McKean, who served as Director of Policy Planning in the State Department, as well as Staff Director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and as Ambassador to Luxembourg. Ambassador McKean's work, titled Watching Darkness Fall, FDR, His Ambassadors, and the Rise of Adolf Hitler, is a masterful account of the interplay between FDR and his four key ambassadorial appointees in Europe during the 1930s, as well as of the rivalries among those appointees, including Joe Kennedy Sr. and William Dodds of Garden of Beasts fame. The Council recently held a book forum with Ambassador McKean, whose descriptions of the often little understood pivotal roles of those envoys and of the fast-moving political events of that era in America and Germany make for a fascinating read. We'll be sending that on to you this week. With that, again, Ambassador Frank Wisner, many thanks for your participation and your shared wisdom this morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Good wishes to all of you for your conference. I'm enormously impressed by the quality of the questions, the direction you're going in, and look forward to my continued association. And indeed, I would be very, very pleased to help you think through the directions you will take in the spring. Things are going on in the Western Balkans. They're dangerous, they're underattended, and you're right to give it priority. Tim, thank you, and everyone, thanks very much for your hospitality.